So I'm one of 9 children of an Irish Catholic family. I grew up in the Midwest. I graduated from Purdue and came to New Orleans actually to study to become a priest. And when I was growing up, the priests were the people who were involved in social justice work, and I wanted to be like them. So I came to New Orleans and went to school out on Carrollton Avenue at Notre Dame Seminary. Well, I actually, worked in some parishes in New Orleans for a couple of years and realized that I was much more interested in the social justice part of being a priest than I was in the Mass and the sacraments and those things. And I decided that I would try to do some social work. So I moved into the area by the St. Thomas housing development in the Irish Channel. And I was like an unlicensed social worker with a bunch of Catholic nuns who were living in the St. Thomas housing development. Did that for a couple of years. I didn't exactly know what poor people's lawyers did other than legal aid or public defender, that sort of stuff. But that's why I went to law school. That's what I was interested in. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to find a way to practice that most of my career. So when I moved into the Irish Channel, I worked with a couple of Catholic sisters who lived in the St. Thomas housing development, and there was another community of about a dozen Catholic sisters who lived on the edge, and that's where we did our work, in their house. And that's where I was fortunate enough to meet my wife. She was a Catholic sister, an apprentice sister at that time, and I had just come out of the seminary from studying to be a priest, and we hit it off and had similar values in that, and she left the sisterhood, and we ultimately got married. When I was applying to law school, I wanted to stay in New Orleans because I wanted to stay connected with these groups of people, primarily the people in the St. Thomas housing development, who I had come to know and love, really. And so I looked at both Loyola and Tulane, and Loyola was the only one of the schools that had a clinical program at that time, and therefore I thought that would help me get through the 3 years of law school, knowing that in the third year I could actually do work with them. When I graduated, I started working at Legal Services Corporation, and I worked with what was then New Orleans Legal Assistance Corporation. I worked on the West Bank in Marrero in just a service office, and I worked also in Kenner at an office there. Well, after I'd been at Legal Services for a while, New Orleans elected its first African-American mayor, Dutch Morial. And I had a friend, David Marcello, who was executive counsel to the mayor, and he invited me to come over there and work with the city to try to help them do their federal programs. And those days, community development block grants, they had an employment program, they had healthcare programs and the like, and they needed a lawyer to work on that. So I went over there and was an assistant city attorney for about a year through the police strike in New Orleans and a lot of other things. But I ultimately didn't feel like the work that I was doing at the city was as hands-on and as important to me and to the people I was working with as the legal services work. So I went back to legal services and spent a couple more years there, and really stayed there until Ronald Reagan was elected president. And when he was elected president, he did a lot of cutbacks on the Legal Services Corporation in terms of the kinds of work legal services was allowed to do. And so myself and a couple other people left legal services at that time. It would have been the very early 80s, and started a private practice. And at that time, I became the general counsel for the ACLU of Louisiana. I was just, a young lawyer, only been out 4 or 5 years, but they needed somebody to do their work, and I enjoyed civil rights work and public interest work. It was a lot of volunteer lawyers from around the country who were helping out, trying to prevent executions of people. and they needed a local lawyer to be their partner to practice in Louisiana courts. So I did that for a number of people. I was only successful in one of those, and several of my clients were executed. In one, I was there for the execution, and at that time I was working hand in hand with Sister Helen Prejean and various citizen and religious groups against the death penalty. So that was a very, very big part of what I did for a long time. Well, I've been in private practice for, I think, 5 or 8 years, something like that, and Loyola called. It was Dean Lewis Westerfield, who was the dean at Loyola at that point, the first African-American dean at Loyola, and he called and said that they needed somebody to teach this course in law and poverty, that Loyola has made a required course for all students. And they had a Jesuit priest who had been teaching it, Jesuit priest and lawyer who had been teaching it, but he went on sabbatical, and then he didn't come back from sabbatical, and they were backed up because this was a required course and people needed it to graduate. And would I come over there and pitch in on a temporary basis to help out? And I'd always had a passion for poverty law and poor people and economic justice issues and the like for poor people. And so that was an area that I really liked. And I started teaching it on a part-time basis. And, 25 plus years later, I'm still here. Kinds of campaigns we did in Plaquemine Parish for all black community in Plaquemine Parish that didn't have running water. Their water was brought in on a tank, twice a week. And there was pipeline that came right up to that community, served the white community, and there was another pipeline that started after that community, served the white community in another part. But they decided that they were tired of this and they were going to do something about it. So we filed suits, in federal court. We filed administrative complaints with the Department of Justice. They had protests. They held rallies. They held human rights hearings and the like. And over a period of years, the story was picked up by 60 Minutes. It was a constant question to the leaders of the parish. And as a result of all of these things, they ultimately got running water, which was a terrific advancement. And this happened in the very first couple of years that I was a lawyer. And I realized that the lawyer's role was important, and we had a lot to give, but that the lawyers have a lot to get as well, is that we get a lot from the people that we're working with, and they educate me about politics, they educate me about communication, about those sorts of things. And that, I think, is what sort of movement lawyering, or I call it social justice lawyering, is about. Later in my career, I became the legal director for the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and I had been a lawyer for a long time, and I had been at Loyola probably, 20 years by that time, and I had to do a job interview with like 40 people in a room that they wanted to ask me questions. And one of the questions I got was, who was your best teacher to become a great lawyer? And because I'd been at Loyola for 20 years, I hadn't done a job interview in a very long time, so I didn't have like easy answers to a lot of these questions that if you do a lot of interviews, I guess you would. And I thought about it for a while. I was really stumped for a little bit, and then I realized and told them that it really was the mothers and the grandmothers of the St. Thomas housing development who were my best teachers. Now, these are folks who, by and large, maybe had a high school education. A lot of people didn't even finish high school. But I helped them and I taught them about public records requests and lawsuits against the Housing Authority and HUD to try to make housing better. But they taught me what it means to be in charge of a family of your children and your grandchildren and living on $600 a month and being willing to walk a mile or mile and a half each way at night to come to a meeting or to go to a protest, to hold a candlelight vigil in that. A friend of mine said, would you come up to Loyola and give a talk to a group of people who are thinking about going and sitting in the federal courthouse because to protest U.S. policy in Latin America after soldiers in El Salvador assassinated a number of Jesuits and several women who worked in their offices with them. And these were soldiers that were trained by the U.S. government at an institution called School of the Americas. And I went to that meeting, and I ended up representing the people who did this. They went down to the federal administrative offices and blocked the elevators and were ultimately convicted of disturbing the peace in a federal building. But direct action by people and people willing to risk arrest and jail is a small part, but an important part of social change. And it's a part that they really need a lawyer for. And so I have represented, well over 100 people in federal courts in Georgia. I've represented people in New York who were opposed to the Iraq War from day one, and people in North Dakota who were opposed to nuclear weapons, people in Nevada who were trying to stop drone warfare, and most recently an 82-year-old sister and a couple other people in their 60s who went on to a nuclear weapons storage place in Knoxville, Tennessee to ask for disarmament and, spray painted on the sides of the buildings and the like. And, they knew they were going to be arrested. They knew they were going to jail, but they will be historically remembered as people being on the right side. I think that Katrina was a profound experience for me personally and for our community and for the legal profession. Loyola and Tulane and all the schools in New Orleans closed because of the hurricane damage. Our law school was fortunate enough to set up in Houston, and the clinic that I work with set up spots with the Red Cross and the like over there. So we got to reconnect with a lot of people from the community and to be a part of the voting rights questions, the housing justice questions, the FEMA questions, the way the money was distributed questions and all that. There were a lot of civil rights struggles and economic rights struggles in those, and I was fortunate enough to participate in those. Over the years, I have had plenty of opportunities to leave New Orleans, and I did leave for a couple of years in New York, but I found that I really missed the sense of community, and I really missed the friendship and the opportunities you have when you work with others. One of my mentors once is a Jesuit priest named Daniel Berrigan, who was in and out of jail for civil disobedience things, and I introduced him once at a conference, said that this is one of my heroes. And he said, he corrected me right there on the spot and said, look, I don't believe in heroes. I believe in community. And by staying in New Orleans and working with the people in public housing, working with the people who are fighting for economic justice or fighting for civil rights and the legal community and the like, makes my life meaningful. People say, are you happy? I mean, I don't think happiness is the only goal in life. I think meaningfulness is the goal in life. And by putting a life into working on social justice issues with other lawyers, but also with lots of other people, is a great way to have a meaningful life. And it's hard to do that if you're not part of the community. And so this is my community. This is my family. So, I'm nearly 70 years old, and I've been doing this for 40 years as a lawyer, 40 plus years as a lawyer, and did it before that as a social worker. So I don't think I'm really going to change much, and even though I will certainly retire as an official member of the Loyola Law School faculty, I think Loyola is a home, and I will continue to stay here and do what I can to contribute to doing social justice law for individuals and groups in our communities, for as long as I can. And I look forward to that because I do enjoy that and I do find that meaningful.